That's really hard because I actually got my recording contract when I was 14, but I first started acting when I was 10.
There is great, great work ahead. Tonight, your baby sister has made it.
On February 1st, 2004, in Houston, Texas, around 8:30 p.m. Eastern, during the Super Bowl 38 halftime show watched by more than 150 million people, Janet Jackson lost control of her own story, in real time, on the biggest stage in America. In less than 5 seconds, the cameras captured a single exposed moment on live television. But what truly ended an era didn't happen on that stage. It began in the hours and days after, when emergency phone calls lit up boardrooms, crisis meetings went down behind closed doors, and powerful executives quietly decided who would take the fall. Within a week, Janet was pushed out of award shows. Her music vanished from major networks. Her name became radioactive inside the industry. Meanwhile, the man standing next to her that night kept moving forward like nothing happened. This isn't a story about a wardrobe malfunction or a split-second mistake. This is a story about what happens after the scandal, when silence becomes strategy, when blame turns into currency, and when Janet Jackson realized exactly who was willing to let her stand alone. To understand why February 1st, 2004 cut Janet so deeply, you have to rewind decades, back to a small house in Gary, Indiana, where silence wasn't optional, it was survival. Janet was born in 1966, the youngest child in the Jackson family. From the moment she could walk, her world was shaped by discipline, fear, and control under the authority of her father, Joe Jackson. In that house, mistakes weren't brushed off, emotions weren't encouraged, obedience was protection, and quiet was safety. Janet learned early that rebellion wasn't the move, restraint was. She learned to take pressure without flinching, to keep pain private, to never let the outside world see where she was bleeding. As her brothers rose to global fame, especially Michael Jackson, Janet watched closely. She saw how exposure swallowed people whole, how talent turned into a cage, how the public felt entitled to every detail once fame hit. By the time Janet began her solo career in the mid-1980s, she had already made a silent promise to herself. She would not live the same way. Where Michael's life became an open display, Janet chose control. She built her entire identity around it. Control of sound, control of image, control of narrative. She didn't just want success, she wanted boundaries. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, Janet carefully separated herself from the Jackson brand, from Motown nostalgia, and from the image of a child star. Albums like Control and Rhythm Nation weren't marketing accidents, they were declarations. She presented herself as disciplined, intentional, and emotionally contained. Even when her music tackled vulnerability or social issues, it was always on her terms, through choreography, production, and precision. Nothing was left to chance, because chance meant exposure, and exposure was dangerous. That obsession with control only deepened as Janet moved into adulthood, especially in her personal life. In 1984, at just 18 years old, she secretly married James DeBarge, a member of the DeBarge musical family. The marriage unraveled quickly under instability and pressure. But what mattered more than the breakup itself was how Janet handled it, quietly, privately, and without feeding the public machine. Because even back then, Janet Jackson knew one thing for sure. Once the world gets inside your story, it never lets go. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't explain herself. She didn't rush to microphones or let tabloids shape her image. When that relationship ended, it vanished almost without a trace. And Janet carried that lesson forward. Silence protects. Years later, she repeated the same pattern on an even bigger scale. In the early 1990s, Janet entered a relationship with dancer and songwriter Renee Elizondo Jr. They married in secret and stayed together for nearly 9 years without public confirmation. No red carpets, no interviews, no headlines. Even as Janet became one of the biggest pop stars on the planet, she guarded that relationship like classified information. When the marriage ended in 2000, Janet reportedly paid millions to keep the details sealed, not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear of losing control over her own story. For Janet, privacy wasn't a luxury, it was armor. That fear shaped her art. In 1997, with the release of The Velvet Rope, Janet cracked the door open for the first time. She explored trauma, sexuality, depression, and emotional pain. Raw, honest, and deeply personal. But there was one non-negotiable rule. Janet controlled the narrative. The public could listen, but they couldn't interrogate. She invited people into her inner world carefully, selectively, and with firm boundaries. Vulnerability was allowed only when she authored it. By the early 2000s, Janet was at the absolute top. All For You dominated the charts. Her tours sold out worldwide. Inside the industry, her reputation was locked in. Professional, meticulous, prepared. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. Every move was rehearsed. Every decision measured. So when Janet was chosen to headline the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show, it wasn't seen as a gamble. It was seen as recognition of her control. What the public didn't understand was how deep that control ran psychologically. For Janet, exposure without consent wasn't just embarrassment, it was a flashback. A return to childhood helplessness. Being watched, judged, punished, with no way to respond. That feeling was exactly what she'd spent her entire life running from. That's why, long before the Super Bowl, Janet feared scandal less than she feared losing ownership of her narrative. And that's what makes what happened next so devastating. On February 1st, 2004, Janet didn't just experience a public incident, she experienced a collapse. Within seconds, the system that had protected her since childhood, control through silence, was gone. Her body, her image, her story, no longer hers. The media spoke for her. Executives spoke for her. The industry decided who she was without asking. And a woman who had spent nearly 40 years mastering containment was exposed on the most public stage imaginable. This chapter of Janet Jackson's life isn't about a pop star scared of scandal. It's about a woman who learned early that survival meant staying quiet, staying composed, and staying in control. And when that control was taken from her, it didn't just shake her career. It ripped open wounds she had spent a lifetime sealing shut. That's why, when the fallout began, Janet didn't react with chaos or rage. She reacted the only way she knew how, by going silent again. She reacted the only way she knew how. She went silent. And that silence, once her greatest shield, would soon become the very weapon others used to decide her fate. What protected Janet Jackson for decades was about to turn against her in the loudest way possible. Between 2001 and 2003, bouncing from Los Angeles to New York, two careers were moving in opposite directions. If Janet entered the early 2000s guarding everything she built, Justin Timberlake stepped into that same moment trying to escape everything he'd been. By 2001, Justin was just 20 years old, freshly peeled away from NSYNC and standing at a crossroads that chews up young pop stars fast. The boy band era made him rich and famous, but it also boxed him in tight. To the industry, he was still the smiling, choreographed teen idol, and that image felt like a ceiling pressing down hard. When Justified dropped in 2002, it worked. On paper, the album sold. Radio hits landed. A more grown version of Justin showed up. But behind closed doors, the verdict stayed cautious. Execs liked the numbers, but the whispers didn't stop. Still transitioning, still unproven, not quite there yet. Justin needed more than charts. He needed credibility. He needed moments that felt bigger than radio spins. And above all, he needed proximity to someone whose power wasn't questioned. That's where Janet Jackson entered the picture. By late 2003, when talks of Super Bowl 38 started circulating, Janet's position couldn't have been more different. She wasn't experimenting. She wasn't rebuilding. She was a veteran, a global icon, and one of the very few black women ever trusted with the halftime stage by MTV, the NFL, and CBS. Justin with Janet was pitched as youth meets dominance, energy meets legacy. But for Justin, it was something else entirely. Access to unquestioned power. Here's what their relationship wasn't. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't personal. No late-night calls, no deep bond, no shared social circle. People around both artists described it as strictly professional. Polite, distant, and transactional. Janet focused on execution. Justin focused on opportunity. They weren't equal in leverage, even if they looked equal on paper. Behind the scenes, the imbalance was already forming. Janet's name carried weight, but it also carried exposure. Decades of scrutiny followed her everywhere. Every move filtered through race, gender, and sexuality. Justin, meanwhile, stood on safer ground. Young, male, white, framed by the media as charming instead of threatening. That difference mattered way more than anyone admitted at the time. As rehearsals rolled closer, the production followed the usual Super Bowl chaos: tight schedules, endless approvals, and creative ideas bouncing through layers of execs. According to anonymous insiders who later spoke to music journalists, nothing about the performance was framed to Janet as reckless. The goal was spectacle, not scandal. Still, whispers floated quietly backstage. Rumors that some last-second ideas were tossed around loosely, without the crystal-clear consent Janet was known for demanding. And that's where the cracks began to form, the kind you don't notice until everything breaks at once. No one wrote those conversations down. No one locked in responsibility. And that gray area, that ambiguity, would become the most dangerous part of all. Because when everything exploded, there was no paper trail, no clear ownership, and no shared accountability. For Justin Timberlake, that halftime performance wasn't just another gig. It was supposed to be a career-defining leap. This was his moment to stand on the biggest stage in American entertainment and finally be seen, not as a former boy band star, but as a full-fledged leading man. People close to Justin later said he felt intense pressure to make the moment unforgettable. Something bold, something that would permanently separate him from his past. But unforgettable doesn't always mean survivable, especially when the fallout has to land somewhere and someone has to take the hit. As the date approached, the contrast between them became sharper. Janet turned inward. She rehearsed relentlessly. She monitored choreography, timing, and presentation with surgical focus. She treated the performance the same way she treated every major appearance: controlled, intentional, and airtight. Justin moved differently. He trusted the system. He leaned into momentum. He was more open to improvisation, more willing to believe that the machine around him would catch any mistakes. That difference in mindset would matter a lot when everything unraveled. What happened next often gets reduced to one gesture, one camera angle, one frozen frame. But the real damage started before the lights ever came on. It started with the unspoken assumptions both artists were carrying. Janet assumed control would protect her. Justin assumed momentum would carry him forward. Neither fully accounted for how fast the system would choose sides once outrage hit. When the media storm erupted and executives scrambled to contain the narrative, those assumptions collided hard. Janet found herself facing questions that framed intent, blame, and responsibility almost entirely on her shoulders. Justin released statements that were broad, careful, and non-confrontational. He didn't stand beside her publicly. He didn't challenge the narrative forming around her. And from the industry's point of view, he didn't need to. This is where resentment took root. Not because Justin panicked, many people would have, but because his withdrawal fit perfectly into a system already prepared to protect him while isolating her. Janet saw it immediately. She had spent her entire career reading rooms, tracking power, and knowing when silence stopped being neutral and started becoming a weapon. She watched the conversation shift from what happened to who must pay, and she knew exactly who the system was shielding. People who later spoke about those weeks described Janet as calm on the surface, but internally devastated. She didn't rage publicly. She didn't accuse. She calculated. According to multiple accounts, Janet made a deliberate decision to limit Justin's involvement in the fallout. She advised him to say less, not more, to let the noise burn itself out, to allow the industry to do what it always does in moments like this: isolate the most vulnerable target and move on. That decision is often mistaken for forgiveness. It wasn't. It was recognition. Janet understood the machine had already decided the outcome, and she understood that Justin, whether intentionally or not, was benefiting from that decision. The resentment that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet, controlled, and deeply personal. The kind that doesn't fade with time, because it's built on clarity, not confusion. It was never really about the performance itself. It wasn't about choreography, costuming, or a split-second mistake. What cut deepest for Janet Jackson was the realization that when the moment arrived, when everything was on the line, Justin Timberlake had a choice. He could step forward with her, or he could let the system move past him and crush her instead. He chose the safer path. And for Janet, a woman who had spent her entire life designing walls against exactly that kind of exposure, that choice hurt more than any headline ever could. Super Bowl night, the move, the silence, and the betrayal. February 1st, 2004, Reliant Stadium, Houston, Texas. By the time the halftime countdown hit 0, nothing about the night felt dangerous. Inside the stadium, more than 70,000 fans were roaring. Outside, over 150 million viewers were locked in. Janet Jackson stepped onto the field the same way she had stepped onto every major stage for decades, prepared, controlled, and confident. Every beat had been timed, every movement rehearsed, every camera angle approved. This wasn't her first live broadcast. It wasn't her first high-risk performance, and it was never meant to be her final moment of control. The show unfolded exactly as planned. Lights hit on cue. Dancers rotated cleanly. The choreography stayed precise and tight. Nothing felt unstable. When Justin Timberlake joined her for the final segment, the moment read as symbolic, a smooth handoff between generations. The veteran icon sharing the biggest platform in American entertainment with the rising star. There were no warning signs, no visible tension, no sense that anything was about to fracture. Then came the final lyric, "I'm gonna have you naked by the end of this song." The line wasn't improvised. It had been approved, cleared, rehearsed. It was meant as metaphor, provocative, but contained. What followed was not. As the music hit its final beat, Justin stepped forward and executed the closing move. There was no pause, no visible cue to the camera crew, no moment for Janet to react. In less than a second, her costume was pulled open, and the broadcast crossed a line it could never uncross. The cameras didn't cut away. The stadium didn't fall silent, but Janet did. She didn't scream. She didn't have time to cover herself. She didn't regain control in that instant. Her body was no longer hers to manage. It belonged to the broadcast feed, to the headlines forming in real time, and to a public that would replay the moment endlessly, stripped of context, intent, or mercy. When the lights went down and the performance ended, Janet walked off the field in shock. Crew members later described her as eerily calm on the surface, frozen underneath. There was no immediate confrontation, no shouting, no accusation, just confusion spreading through the production area as reality set in. Phones started ringing. Executives realized what had just gone out live to the entire country. Within minutes, crisis mode took over. Network executives began calling one another. Lawyers were pulled in. Public relations teams rushed to contain the fallout. The conversation shifted instantly. Not what happened, but who would pay for it. And in those first chaotic hours, something crucial failed to happen. There was no unified response, no joint statement, no visible solidarity. Janet waited. She waited for clarity. She waited for accountability. She waited for someone to stand beside her, not behind closed doors, not later, but in that critical window when narratives are formed and reputations are decided. That moment never came. People close to Janet later said she expected just one thing, not a public apology tour, not a press conference, just a shared response. Two artists standing side by side, one statement, one acknowledgement that the moment was a mistake, not an intention. That moment never came. Less than 24 hours after the broadcast, Janet issued her public apology. It was direct, formal, and final. She accepted responsibility, emphasized that the incident was unintended, and expressed regret for any offense caused. It was the language of containment, and it placed her squarely at the center of the fallout. The media seized on it immediately. Justin Timberlake's response followed a very different path. His statements were brief, carefully phrased, and distant. He leaned on the phrase wardrobe malfunction, avoided describing the action itself, and never fully connected his name to responsibility in the same way. There was no joint apology, no shared interview, no visual of unity. That silence between them became the loudest sound of the entire scandal. As news coverage intensified, the narrative hardened fast. Janet's name appeared in headlines alongside words like indecency, shock, and outrage. Her past work, especially The Velvet Rope, was reframed as evidence of intent rather than expression. Commentators questioned her judgment. Politicians demanded consequences. Advocacy groups called for accountability. Behind closed doors, the industry moved just as quickly. Meetings were held in network offices where Janet was not present. Decisions were made about appearances, playlists, and invitations without her involvement. Within days, her scheduled role at the Grammy Awards quietly vanished. Radio stations reduced or stopped playing her music. Television networks distanced themselves. The message was unmistakable. Someone had to pay, and the bill was being handed to her. Justin, meanwhile, kept moving. His tour dates stayed intact. His radio presence continued. There were no immediate professional consequences visible to the public. Two people had been involved in the same incident, yet only one had been chosen to absorb the punishment. This was the moment Janet fully understood what was happening. The damage was no longer about the performance, it was about abandonment. Those who spoke with Janet during that period described her anger as quiet, internal, and devastating. She didn't lash out publicly. She didn't accuse Justin by name. Instead, she evaluated the situation with painful clarity. She saw how quickly the system protected one person and isolated the other. She understood that speaking out aggressively would only accelerate her own erasure. According to her later accounts, she made a decision that still surprises many. She advised Justin to say less, not more, to avoid escalating the situation, to let the storm focus on her if that was what the system demanded. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't generosity, it was strategy. Janet understood the machinery was already in motion, and fighting it head-on would destroy both of them. But understanding doesn't erase resentment. The betrayal was never just the moment on stage. It was what came after, the absence, the silence, and the choice to let her stand alone while he remained safely on the perimeter. Janet did not need a hero. She needed a witness, and she never got one. In the days after the Super Bowl clip replayed on loop across every network, Janet Jackson watched her own life story get rewritten without her permission. The woman who spent decades protecting her image was suddenly reduced to one word: scandal. The silence that once kept her safe now worked against her. It gave space for others to speak for her while she quietly absorbed the fallout. That's the truth most people never talk about. The real damage didn't happen in 5 seconds on stage. It happened afterward, in closed rooms, private calls, and meetings she was never invited into. Statements were drafted without her, decisions were made without her, and in that moment, Janet realized something chilling. When the system needed a sacrifice, she had been left standing alone, and once she understood that, her relationship with Justin Timberlake was never the same again. If Super Bowl night was the explosion, the weeks that followed were the slow, deliberate shutdown. By mid-February 2004, Janet knew the scandal had moved out of public view and into places she could never access. Boardrooms, executive offices, whispered phone calls where outcomes were locked in before she ever heard a word. What shocked her wasn't the outrage on television. It was how fast the industry decided who would take the hit. The first blow came suddenly. Janet had been scheduled to appear at the 2004 Grammy Awards, a stage she had earned many times over. Then, almost overnight, the invitation vanished. No clear explanation, no public announcement, just a quiet message passed through intermediaries saying her appearance was no longer appropriate. The message was loud, even without words. The punishment had begun. As news of the snub leaked, the narrative hardened fast. Janet wasn't just being criticized, she was being disciplined in public as a warning sign. Then more doors started closing. Music directors at MTV and VH1 quietly reduced her presence. Some stations stopped playing her altogether. Radio programmers who once championed her suddenly hid behind phrases like listener sensitivity and corporate guidance. Invitations that once arrived automatically now required review or never arrived at all. Each move looked small on its own. Together, they formed a wall. Behind the scenes, whispers spread fast. According to multiple journalists and executives who later spoke off the record, pressure was coming from the very top. Les Moonves, the most powerful man at Viacom, CBS's parent company. It wasn't framed as punishment, it was framed as control. The message insiders described was blunt. Someone had to be made an example of, and Janet fit the profile too perfectly to ignore. She was visible. She was a black woman. She had explored sexuality openly in her art. And most importantly, she didn't have the same protection as the men making decisions behind closed doors. She wasn't targeted because she was guilty. She was targeted because she was useful. Janet felt the shift immediately. Calls stopped coming back. Meetings were delayed forever. People who once praised her professionalism suddenly spoke in careful, sanitized language. No one accused her outright, but she didn't need an accusation to feel the isolation. The message was clear without being spoken. Janet Jackson had been quietly pushed out, not by scandal alone, but by a system that had already decided she was the easiest one to let fall. And here's the part people don't like to say out loud. Isolation in an industry built on access is a slow erasure. While Janet Jackson watched doors slam shut in real time, Justin Timberlake kept moving forward like nothing touched him. His songs stayed on the radio. His appearances stayed booked. No emergency meetings about his image. No quiet removals. No public discipline. From the outside, it looked like one shared moment with two very different outcomes. And to Janet, it felt like a decision had already been made long before she was ever allowed to speak. Behind the scenes, the pressure got heavier by the day. Advisors warned her not to push back. Lawyers broke it down cold. Don't challenge a media empire during a moral panic. Friends begged her to stay patient. The message stayed the same, and it was terrifying. Fight this and it only gets worse. That's when Janet made the call that would stay with her forever. She reached out to Justin directly. People close to her later described that conversation as calm, controlled, and brutal. No yelling, no finger pointing, just facts. Janet told him straight up. The industry was hunting for a single target. She explained that if he stepped forward too hard, if he demanded shared responsibility or pushed back publicly, the system wouldn't protect him either. It would widen the blast radius. It would take both of them down. Her message was simple and devastating. Don't say anything else. If you speak up, she warned, they'll pull you under too. That wasn't forgiveness. That was triage. Janet was doing what she learned as a child, surviving when authority already made up its mind. She knew how power moves. She knew when resistance sharpens the blade instead of stopping it. And she knew once a sacrifice is chosen, the only question left is how many people get burned with them. Justin followed her advice, and that's where the resentment locked in hard, not because he listened, but because he benefited. Janet never believed Justin was the mastermind behind her punishment. She knew the system was bigger than both of them, but knowing that didn't erase the truth. He was being carried forward while she was being pushed out. His silence became a shield. Her silence became a sentence. As February turned into March, the damage set in. Industry insiders stopped calling Janet a collaborator and started calling her a liability. The phrase, "what happened at the Super Bowl," turned into quiet shorthand for risk. Projects stalled, opportunities disappeared, and every time Janet asked why, the answers came back vague, polished, and final. She watched headlines stack up without her voice. She watched politicians condemn her without context. She watched commentators tear apart her body and her past work like it proved intent. And through all of it, the people who could have shifted the narrative, the ones who could have stood beside her and said this was a collective failure, stayed silent. That silence did something permanent. It turned pain into resentment. Janet didn't hate Justin for what happened on stage. She hated what came after. She hated that when the system showed its cold, strategic face, he had the option to stay protected while she stood exposed. She hated that his career kept rolling inside the same industry that quietly locked her out. And she hated that when survival became the only option left, the entire weight of it landed on her shoulders alone. This was the moment Janet finally understood the real price of being chosen as the example. It wasn't just about lost bookings or bad press. It was the brutal realization that loyalty, fairness, and shared responsibility were conditional, offered only when they didn't threaten power. And once that truth hit, something inside her shut tight. By the end of March 2004, Janet Jackson wasn't fighting to clear her name anymore. She was fighting just to exist inside an industry that had already decided she was expendable. The anger she carried wasn't loud or reckless. It was controlled, disciplined, and permanent. The kind of anger that doesn't explode, it settles. And it settled on one hard truth. When everything collapsed, she stood alone. And the one person who could have stood beside her didn't. That's why this chapter matters. Because the Super Bowl scandal didn't destroy Janet Jackson. Being selected, isolated, and abandoned did. And once that reality set in, her relationship with Justin Timberlake wasn't just strained anymore. It was poisoned. Poisoned by the knowledge that when power demanded a sacrifice, only one of them was offered up, and only one walked away untouched. What followed didn't look like chaos at first. There were no daily screaming headlines, no public breakdowns, no explosive tell-alls. Instead, what happened to Janet was far more calculated and way more brutal. She wasn't canceled loudly, she was slowly erased. In the months after 2004, Janet was still famous on paper. Her name still rang bells. Her catalog still existed. But the energy shifted fast. She stopped being treated like a force shaping culture and started being framed as a relic tied to a scandal. Invitations that once showed up automatically, gone. New music releases, quiet, under-promoted. Industry support, pulled back without explanation. Executives spoke about her like even mentioning her carried risk. Nobody attacked her anymore. They just stepped away. And that silence hit harder than outrage ever could. No enemy to confront. No headline to challenge. Just doors closing one by one. Janet kept working, on her terms. She released albums. She toured. She showed up when she chose. But everything was smaller now. The framing changed. Where she was once called an innovator and a leader, she was suddenly labeled a legacy act way too early. Her sexuality, once praised as bold, intentional, and controlled, became something networks avoided completely. The image of Janet Jackson as a powerful, autonomous symbol of desire got frozen in time, locked to that single moment, never allowed to grow past it. And what made it sting even more was the contrast playing out in real time. While Janet carried the long shadow of 2004, Justin Timberlake entered a whole new level of dominance. Grammy Awards stacked up. Albums rolled out as major cultural moments. Film roles landed. Mainstream respectability locked in. Two careers moved in opposite directions from the same night, and Janet saw it clearly. The cost of being chosen as the example wasn't just what she lost. It was watching someone else thrive inside the very system that quietly pushed her out. In 2018, Justin Timberlake walked back onto the Super Bowl halftime stage like nothing had ever happened. An honor, a comeback, a full circle moment. And Janet Jackson? She was never offered that stage again. To the public, it looked like coincidence. To Janet, it felt like confirmation. And still, she said nothing. Year after year, interviewers kept poking. They asked about the Super Bowl. They asked about Justin. They asked the question everyone wanted answered. Did you feel betrayed? And every single time, Janet deflected with grace, control, and restraint. No attacks, no blow-ups, no headline-hunting reactions. From the outside, it looked like forgiveness. But underneath, it was containment. People close to Janet have said her silence was never about peace. It was about control. She had already learned the lesson the hard way. Speaking out doesn't guarantee justice. Sometimes it just guarantees more punishment. Every time she thought about telling the full story, the same calculation came back. Who benefits? Who pays? And for nearly 2 decades, the answer never changed. Then something shifted. Cultural conversation started catching up. Younger audiences began re-examining 2004 through a sharper lens. Articles, documentaries, retrospectives. Not calling it a scandal anymore, but calling it selective accountability. Janet didn't lead that movement. She didn't campaign. She didn't demand apologies. She watched quietly as other people finally connected the dots. Then, in 2021, Justin Timberlake released a public apology. He admitted he benefited from a system that protected him while harming others, including Janet. The internet exploded. Debates everywhere. But for Janet, that apology wasn't closure. It wasn't healing. It was confirmation. Confirmation of what she already understood back in 2004. Just admitted out loud, years too late, after the damage was already locked in. When Janet finally addressed it herself in her 2022 documentary, her tone stayed calm, measured, controlled. She said they had moved on. She didn't deny the pain. But she didn't weaponize it either. And that's what makes the resentment in this story so hard to see. It was never loud, never public, never messy. It lived in memory. In contrast, in the quiet knowledge that when the moment came, she stood alone. Janet Jackson didn't spend 20 years chasing revenge. She spent 20 years remembering who was protected, who benefited, and how fast the industry decided she was expendable. That's the real truth at the center of this story. Not rage, not chaos, but a long, disciplined silence, carrying the weight of a betrayal that never needed to be shouted to be real. In the end, the man Janet Jackson resented most wasn't the one who caused the moment on stage. It was the one who survived it without standing beside her. Not because of a single action, but because when everything collapsed, he chose silence, safety, and self-preservation. While she was offered up as the example for 20 years, she watched him collect awards, headlines, and even another Super Bowl appearance, while her name became a warning whispered behind closed doors. Her resentment was never posted, never sold, never screamed. It was precise, quiet, permanent, built on the knowledge that when the system needed someone to destroy, it chose her, and he let it happen. So now ask yourself, was Janet's silence forgiveness? Or was it proof that speaking out would have destroyed what little space she had left? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more raw, unfiltered deep dives exposing the real power games behind music and Hollywood history, like, subscribe, share, and hit that bell. Because the most dangerous stories don't end on stage. They end with who was allowed to walk away,